The story of Charles Michael Schwab is one of the most fascinating sagas of America's Gilded Age, a time when fortunes were built from iron, steel, and dreams. It is the story of a man who climbed from the humblest beginnings to stand among kings of industry, only to lose everything he had built. His life is a portrait of ambition, glory, and tragedy, and the magnificent mansion he left behind mirrored every rise and fall of his journey. Imagine building a home so magnificent that even the most powerful names in New York, the Vanderbilts, the Astors, and the Carnegies, stood in stunned admiration. Newspapers called it the most dazzling private residence in America. Its halls were filled with light, art, and music. Yet, just a few decades later, its owner, once one of the richest men alive, would die in a small apartment, almost forgotten by the world he had once conquered. This is the story of Charles Schwab, the boy who dreamed beyond the limits of his world, the man who built an empire of steel, and the legend whose palace became a ghost. Humble beginnings in Pennsylvania. Charles Michael Schwab was born on February 18, 1862, in the quiet little town of Williamsburg, Pennsylvania. His parents were John and Pauline Schwab, hard-working German Catholics who believed deeply in honesty, faith, and effort. Life in their small wooden home was simple and modest. There was no electricity, no running water, and no luxury, only the steady rhythm of work and prayer. The Schwabs were not wealthy, but their house was rich in something far greater: determination. From a young age, Charles showed a spark that set him apart. He was curious about everything. He asked questions no one else thought to ask, about machines, bridges, and how things worked. He devoured books when he could find them, reading by the faint light of a kerosene lamp after long days of chores. But in the 1800s, life in rural Pennsylvania was not easy. When Charles was still a teenager, he left school to help support his family. His first job was at a small grocery store, stocking shelves, weighing sugar, and carrying bags for customers. It wasn't glamorous, but it taught him something he would never forget: the value of persistence. Still, deep inside, Charles Schwab dreamed of something more. He didn't want to spend his life behind a counter. He wanted to build, to create, and to lead. His dream was simple yet enormous: to rise above his circumstances and shape the world around him, a leap into the world of steel. One day, fate stepped in. As a teenager, Charles managed to get a job at the Carnegie Steel Company, owned by Andrew Carnegie, one of the most powerful men in America. The steel industry was booming, and Pittsburgh had become its beating heart. The mills roared day and night, their chimneys pouring black smoke into the sky, symbols of progress and power. At first, Charles Schwab was just another laborer among thousands. The work was brutal. Inside the mill, the heat was suffocating, and the clang of metal never stopped. Sparks flew like fireflies, and the smell of molten steel filled the air. Men worked long hours for little pay, and accidents were common, but Charles was not like most workers. He watched, listened, and learned. He paid attention to how the machinery worked, how supervisors managed their crews, and how each part of the process fit into the whole. He didn't just do his job, he studied the business. His sharp mind and natural charisma soon caught the attention of his bosses. He had a rare combination of technical skill and charm. Workers respected him, managers trusted him. Even Andrew Carnegie himself began to notice this young man with a quick wit and endless energy. Within a few short years, Charles Schwab rose from a common laborer to a foreman and then to superintendent. By his mid-20s, he was already managing one of the company's major mills. His rise was nothing short of astonishing, a new kind of leader. What truly set Charles Schwab apart was not just his intelligence, it was his spirit. While many industrial leaders of the time ruled through fear, Schwab led through inspiration. He understood people. He believed that every worker wanted to be proud of his job, and he made them feel valued. He once said, "The way to get things done is not to drive people, but to lead them." That simple belief became the foundation of his success. He walked through the mills greeting workers by name, asking about their families, praising good work. He smiled easily, laughed often, and made people feel part of something greater than themselves. In an age of ruthless bosses and harsh conditions, Schwab's kindness stood out. By 1897, at just 35 years old, Charles Schwab had done the unthinkable. Isbier Bisme. He became the president of Carnegie Steel, the largest steel company in the world. For a boy born to a poor carpenter, it was an unbelievable rise, the true embodiment of the American dream. Andrew Carnegie, once his mentor, admired him deeply, but also sensed his ambition. Charlie, Carnegie once said, has more ideas in a week than most men have in a lifetime. And indeed, Schwab was never short of ideas. He saw opportunities everywhere. When J.P. Morgan, the legendary banker, bought out Carnegie Steel in 1901 to form U.S. Steel, Charles Schwab became its first president. Overnight, his salary and stock made him one of the richest men in the country. At that moment, Charles Schwab stood at the peak of success, admired, powerful, and wealthier than he had ever imagined. But this was only the beginning. With great success came great temptation, a taste for the good life. Unlike his old boss, Andrew Carnegie, who lived modestly despite his wealth, Charles Schwab believed that money should be enjoyed. He had a deep love for music, art, and beauty. He attended operas, collected paintings, and filled his homes with fine furniture from Europe. He hosted grand dinners where guests dined under crystal chandeliers and listened to orchestras play. He once admitted with a grin, "I like to see the wheels go around, not only in my mills but in my social life." To Charles Schwab, life was meant to be lived fully. He bought expensive cars, entertained lavishly, and traveled the world in style. He loved the thrill of the new century, the fast cars, the electric lights, and the growing skyline of New York City. By the early 1900s, Schwab had it all: wealth, fame, and power. But there was one dream left to fulfill, a dream that would define his legacy. He wanted to build a house that would stand as a monument to everything he had achieved. A home so grand that even the mighty Vanderbilts and Astors would whisper his name with awe. A palace that would make history. Building the Palace of Dreams, Chateau Schwab. When Charles Schwab decided to build a home worthy of his success, he wanted more than comfort. He wanted a symbol, a palace that announced to the world that the poor carpenter's son had risen higher than anyone ever expected. Choosing the wrong side of town. In the early 1900s, the richest families in New York were racing to outshine one another along Fifth Avenue, beside Central Park. That stretch of mansions was known as Millionaires' Row. There, the Vanderbilts, Astors, and Carnegies lived behind marble facades and gilded gates. But Charles Schwab wanted to be different. He didn't want to copy other men's castles. He wanted to surprise them. So he chose land far away from Fifth Avenue, on Riverside Drive, overlooking the wide, glittering Hudson River between 73rd and 74th Streets. At the time, that choice shocked society. The rich whispered that Riverside Drive was the wrong side of town. Too quiet, too far, too ordinary. But Schwab smiled at the gossip. He told his wife, Joanna Schwab, "Our home will be so beautiful, no one will dare refuse an invitation." A disagreement at home, Joanna Dinky. Schwab had grown up loving music, art, and city life. She adored New York's grand theaters and elegant parties near Central Park. When her husband announced they were building far away from the center of high society, she was horrified. To her, Riverside Drive sounded like exile. She feared her friends would stop visiting and that she would fade from the glittering social world she loved. But Charles could be persuasive. He painted a vision of a palace on a hill, gardens full of roses, grand halls glowing with light, and views of the river that no Fifth Avenue mansion could match. Reluctantly, Urena agreed, and so began one of the most ambitious construction projects New York had ever seen. The French Vision. To bring his dream to life, Schwab hired Maurice Heber, a young French-born architect trained in Paris. Most millionaires of the time hired famous American names such as Stanford White or Richard Morris Hunt. But Charles Schwab wanted something that felt authentically European. "I don't want another Fifth Avenue house," he reportedly told Hebert. "I want a home that feels alive, a house that will make people stop in their tracks." The two men worked for months, sketching, arguing, revising, and dreaming. They settled on the Beaux-Arts style, the same grand design used for the Paris Opera House. It was bold, symmetrical, and richly decorated. But Schwab went further. He wanted the mansion to look like a castle lifted straight from the Loire Valley of France. Towers, turrets, carved balconies. A true chateau for America's new royalty. A palace rises. When construction began, New Yorkers were stunned. On a quiet stretch of Riverside Drive, a pink granite castle began to climb toward the sky. Its walls glowed rose-colored in the sunlight. Tall towers pierced the skyline, their slate roofs glimmering like armor. Passers-by stopped to watch as hundreds of masons, sculptors, and carpenters worked day and night. The mansion slowly took shape, a blend of French fantasy and American confidence. Newspapers called it Chateau Schwab. Even before it was finished, it had become famous. It took 4 years and more than 300 workers to complete. The final price, over $6 million, an enormous sum in 1906, equal to roughly $200 million today. Half went into construction and the other half into furnishings and art. The New York Times declared, a mansion to surpass any other city home in America, perhaps even in the world. First impressions. Visitors approaching Chateau Schwab found themselves entering a dream. A grand iron gate opened to a curving driveway surrounded by lawns, fountains, and marble statues. At night, electric lamps lined the path, casting golden light on trimmed hedges and blooming roses. Ahead stood the main entrance, a wide staircase of white marble leading to towering wooden doors carved with bronze details. Above them hung the Schwab family crest, a symbol of pride and power. Inside waited a world of wonder. The grand foyer stretched 2 stories high, its floor polished to a mirror shine. Marble columns gleamed beneath golden chandeliers. Stained glass windows bathed the room in colors of ruby, sapphire, and emerald. Guests often paused at the threshold, speechless. Every inch of the mansion shouted success, not in words, but in the sheer beauty of its craftsmanship. Inside the palace, Charles Schwab demanded perfection. The mansion contained 75 rooms, and every door, window, and staircase was handcrafted. Over 100 artists worked on the interiors, painters, sculptors, wood carvers, and metalworkers from around the world. Each room had its own theme, its own mood, its own story. The Grand Hall. The heart of the house was the Grand Hall, so large that voices echoed from wall to wall. A sweeping staircase curved upward like a river of marble, guarded by mahogany rails carved with flowers and vines above. A massive crystal chandelier sparkled with thousands of prisms. At the top of the stairs hung a portrait of Charles Schwab himself, painted to remind every visitor whose kingdom they had entered. The ballroom. Next came the ballroom, a space built for music and movement. Its oak-paneled walls glowed with gold leaf. The ceiling was painted with angels and clouds, as if heaven itself hovered above the dancers. A giant organ stood against one wall, ready to fill the air with sound. During parties, orchestras played as hundreds of guests in silk gowns and tuxedos danced beneath the lights. When the chandeliers reflected on the mirrors, the entire room shimmered like liquid sunlight. Charles and Urena Schwab became legendary hosts. Their gatherings drew the most famous people of the day, politicians, artists, and even European nobles. For a night, the Hudson River sparkled with the glow of Chateau Schwab's windows, a private chapel, and hidden luxuries. Though he loved grandeur, Charles Schwab was also a devout Catholic. He built a private chapel inside the mansion, a room of marble and stained glass that glowed like a jewel when the sun poured through its windows. The altar was carved from white stone, and visitors compared the space to a cathedral in miniature. Beneath the mansion lay even more wonders. There was one of the first indoor swimming pools ever built in a private home, its tiles glimmering blue and green. Nearby were a bowling alley, gymnasium, and even a small power plant that generated electricity for the entire estate. 6 elevators connected the floors, a miracle of modern technology at the time, and early air conditioning kept the rooms cool in summer. At a time when most Americans still lived without electricity, the Schwabs enjoyed comforts that seemed like science fiction. The art gallery. Among all the rooms, the art gallery was the crown jewel. A quarter of the mansion's total cost, today's equivalent of more than $50 million, went into art alone. Paintings by European masters lined the walls. Sculptures from Italy and France stood on marble pedestals. The collection was so impressive that pieces were loaned to the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis. Visitors described the gallery as a museum disguised as a home. For Charles Schwab, the gallery was not just decoration, it was proof. Proof that a boy from a small town could rise to own the treasures of kings. A home that stunned New York. When Chateau Schwab finally opened its doors, New Yorkers were mesmerized. Carriages lined up outside during evening parties, and the press could not get enough of the story. Even Andrew Carnegie, known for his modest brick mansion nearby, admitted with amazement, "Have you seen that place of Charlie's? It makes mine look like a shack." For a time, the Schwabs seemed untouchable, a couple living at the very peak of America's gilded glory. But behind the laughter, champagne, and music, shadows were beginning to form. The palace that symbolized triumph would soon become a cage of loneliness and loss. The gilded dream fades, life inside Chateau Schwab, and the Great Fall. For a while, Chateau Schwab stood as a glittering symbol of the Gilded Age. Its glowing windows could be seen from passing boats at night, and its ballroom echoed with the laughter of America's elite. And in the center of it all stood Charles Schwab, the King of Steel. But time, like fortune, never stands still. Life at the Chateau. In the early 1910s, life inside Chateau Schwab sparkled with nonstop excitement. Charles was a man who adored company. Urana Schwab, once the perfect hostess, glided through these events, dressed in gowns imported from Paris, diamonds glittering under candlelight, but perfection never lasts. A quiet change. Slowly, the atmosphere inside the mansion began to shift. At first, no one noticed. Urana, once the radiant hostess, began to stay upstairs more often. She grew self-conscious about her appearance and increasingly uncomfortable in public. While the music played below, Urana would sometimes sit by her window staring out at the Hudson River. Charles, ever energetic, didn't slow down. He was always moving, always talking, always hosting. But as he dazzled guests with jokes and laughter, a quiet distance grew between husband and wife. They still lived under the same roof, but it was as if two separate worlds existed inside that one great house. The two lives of the Schwabs downstairs, Charles Schwab entertained with boundless charm. He loved stories, laughter, and grand gestures, but he also had a taste for excess. He adored fast cars, horse racing, and gambling. He was said to have lost a fortune at the casino in Monte Carlo in a single night. Yet he laughed about it afterward. "Easy come, easy go," he'd say with a grin. Upstairs, Urana lived a quieter life. Servants brought her breakfast on silver trays. She spent her days reading, writing letters. Once the queen of society, she now avoided the very world that had once adored her. The mansion, which had once symbolized love and triumph, began to feel like a gilded cage, a home with a new purpose. When World War I began in 1914, Urana Schwab stepped out of her isolation to help the war effort. She opened the grand rooms of Chateau Schwab to the American Red Cross, allowing volunteers to use its marble halls to sew clothing and bandages for soldiers overseas. The ballroom that once hosted waltzes now echoed with the sound of sewing machines. For Urana, it was healing. The palace that had once been a stage for pride became a place of purpose. The Roaring Twenties. After the war, America changed. The 1920s brought jazz, electricity, and new wealth. But Charles Schwab refused to be left behind. He invested in everything. He believed the future was his. "There's always another deal to be made," he told friends with a confident grin. But behind the optimism, the world was shifting under his feet. Younger millionaires saw Chateau Schwab not as a marvel, but as a relic, a symbol of a fading era. Still, Charles Schwab continued to spend, to dream, and to live large. He had survived poverty. He believed he could survive anything. The Great Crash. Then came the year 1929, the year that changed everything. In October, the stock market collapsed. Panic swept through Wall Street like wildfire. Fortunes vanished in days. Banks failed. Factories closed. The Great Depression had begun. For Charles Schwab, the crash was devastating. His investments in steel, in railroads, in manufacturing, all began to crumble. His fortune, once measured in tens of millions, began to disappear. At first, he refused to panic. He sold stocks, borrowed money, and mortgaged properties, believing the market would soon recover, but it didn't. The numbers kept falling. Within months, the man who had once built one of the greatest industrial empires in America was struggling to pay his bills, the burden of a palace. The great Chateau Schwab, once his pride, became his greatest problem. Keeping such a massive house running cost a fortune. There were dozens of servants, gardeners, cooks, maids, and engineers. The private power plant had to be fueled. Even as his fortune vanished, Charles refused to give up the mansion. But soon he had no choice. In 1930, he put the estate up for sale for $4 million, far less than what it had cost to build. But no one wanted it. The Great Depression had changed everything. The rich weren't buying palaces anymore. They were selling them. Mansions that once hosted balls now stood dark and empty. Chateau Schwab, too grand and too costly, became unsellable. The fall of a titan. By 1939, Charles Schwab's fortune was gone. The man who had once ruled America's steel empire now found himself nearly penniless servants left. Rooms were sealed off. The gardens grew wild with weeds. That same year, he finally walked out of Chateau Schwab for the last time. He moved into a small apartment on Park Avenue, bringing with him only a few belongings and memories of a life once filled with light. Neighbors described him as kind but quiet, a man who smiled politely but carried the weight of regret in his eyes. On September 18, 1939, Charles Michael Schwab passed away. He had lived a life that spanned the rise of American industry and witnessed his own empire crumble to dust. The man who once owned a palace now left behind little more than a story. The empty giant, the abandonment and destruction of a Chateau Schwab. When Charles Schwab died in 1939, the world he had helped build was already fading into memory, and standing silently above the Hudson River like a forgotten castle from a lost kingdom was Chateau Schwab, his greatest creation and his greatest curse, a palace without a king. After Charles Schwab's death, the mansion on Riverside Drive became eerily quiet. The marble halls that once echoed with laughter and music were now filled with silence. Curtains hung motionless over tall windows. Chandeliers gathered dust. Children in the neighborhood would whisper stories about the ghost house by the river. Some said they saw lights flicker inside at night. Others claimed they could hear faint piano music through the walls. The spirit of Charles Schwab still entertaining guests long after death, a debate over the future. In the early 1940s, as New York grew and modernized, city leaders debated what to do with the empty chateau. Some suggested turning it into a museum, others proposed converting it into an official residence for the city's mayor. But there was a problem: the cost. When the mayor himself visited to inspect the property, he shook his head in disbelief at the gold ceilings and marble staircases. He said quietly, "It's too grand to represent the people." With that, the dream of saving Chateau Schwab was lost. A ghost on Riverside Drive. Throughout the 1940s, the house stood empty, a lonely monument to a bygone world. Weeds climbed the stone walls. Rain seeped through the roof, pigeons nested in the towers. Still, it remained breathtaking. Even in decay, the mansion refused to lose its dignity. People walking along Riverside Drive would often stop and stare. But time, as always, won. The decision. By the late 1940s, New York City was growing faster than ever. The empty chateau with its massive grounds began to look less like a treasure and more like wasted space. The city decided the mansion had no future. Demolition crews arrived quietly, almost respectfully. There were no grand farewells, no speeches, no ceremonies. Just the dull roar of machines and the crack of stone breaking against steel. From palace to rubble, piece by piece, Chateau Schwab began to disappear. The towers that had once touched the sky were the first to fall. The marble columns of the Grand Hall crumbled. The carved staircases and gilded ceilings were ripped apart and thrown into piles of debris. A few people gathered on the sidewalks to watch. "You don't see houses like that anymore," one man reportedly said. By the end, all that remained was a heap of rubble and memory. In just a few weeks, the grandest home in America was gone. The Schwab house, a new beginning. But the land where the chateau once stood didn't remain empty for long. In the early 1950s, construction began on a new building. Not a mansion, but a modern apartment complex, it would house hundreds of ordinary New Yorkers. Ironically, the developers named it the Schwab House, in memory of the man whose palace had once stood there. The name stayed, but the meaning changed. Where Schwab once meant unimaginable wealth and elegance, it now represented practicality, affordable homes for everyday people. Some saw this as a sad ending, but others saw it as poetic justice, proof that time evens out all extremes. Today, the Schwab House still stands on Riverside Drive. Most residents have no idea that beneath their feet once stood a French chateau filled with art, gold, and marble. But if you listen closely on quiet nights, perhaps, just perhaps, you might imagine the faint sound of violins drifting through the air, echoing from a world long gone, a lesson carved in stone. The destruction of Chateau Schwab marked the end of an era. The world that had built such mansions was gone. But in losing Chateau Schwab, New York also lost a piece of its soul, the boldness to dream without limits, legacy of a lost dream. The story of Charles Schwab and his mansion mirrors the story of America during the Gilded Age. It was a time of incredible invention and wealth, but also of imbalance and excess. He embodied both the power and the peril of ambition. He was brilliant and kind, but also reckless. He was, in many ways, both a hero and a warning, the man behind the mansion. He once said, "The man who has done something is always miles ahead of the man who says he will do something." And that was his secret. He did things. He took chances. He dreamed big when others were afraid to. The steel he produced built cities, ships, and the very bones of modern America. What remained after his death? The transformation of a French palace into modest apartments became a symbol of how the world had changed. And perhaps in that quiet change there was a lesson Charles Schwab himself might have understood at last, that even the grandest dreams must someday give way to the lives they inspire. Remembering the dream. Today, if you walk along Riverside Drive, close your eyes for a moment, you can almost hear the sound of carriage wheels, the faint laughter of guests, the deep hum of an orchestra. Then the vision fades. All that remains is the sound of the wind against the river and the soft whisper of history saying, "Nothing lasts forever." A timeless lesson. The story of Charles Schwab and Chateau Schwab isn't just about wealth or loss. It's about what it means to dream. It reminds us that success is fleeting, beauty fades, and time erases even the grandest achievements. But it also reminds us that dreams, courage, and hard work can lift anyone from humble beginnings to unimaginable heights. Charles Schwab began with nothing, no money, no connections, no power, just a fierce belief that he could shape his own destiny. And for a while, he did. He built an empire. He built a palace. He built a life that even after ruin, the world still remembers. That is a legacy far greater than gold or marble, the ghost of the Gilded Age. Every great age leaves behind a ghost. The Gilded Age left behind its palaces. But their stories remain, whispered through time, teaching each new generation that progress always comes with a price. In the end, Charles Schwab achieved everything a man could dream of, except permanence. His house may be gone, but his story remains carved into the spirit of America itself. The final reflection. If you ever find yourself walking along the Hudson at sunset, look toward the gentle curve of Riverside Drive. Imagine, just for a moment, a palace of pink stone standing there, towers gleaming in the fading light. Imagine the laughter, the music, the pride. And then remember that behind every shining success is a fragile heart. And behind every palace stands a dream that time will one day take away. But even when the marble crumbles and the towers fall, the dream remains, living quietly in stories, in memories, and in the eternal human desire to build something beautiful before the world moves on. The story of Charles Schwab is not just the story of one man. It is the story of America itself. Bold, brilliant, flawed, and endlessly reaching for the stars. And though his palace is gone, the echo of his dream still lingers on the wind above the Hudson. A whisper from another age that says, dare greatly, build boldly, and remember, even if time takes everything, the dream is what endures.